The studio buzzed with anticipation as the cameras rolled for another episode of Jimmy Kimmel's talk show. The audience, primed for laughter and light-hearted banter, had no inkling of the storm brewing beneath the surface. George Clooney, the night's marquee guest, strode onto the set with his trademark charm, his smile disarming yet sharp, like a blade hidden in silk. Jimmy, ever the affable host, greeted him with a handshake that lingered a fraction too long, their eyes locking in a way that hinted at unspoken tension. The crowd roared, oblivious to the undercurrent, but something was off. Was it the way Jimmy's laugh sounded forced, or the way George's posture stiffened as he settled into the guest chair? What could possibly unravel between two men who had shared this stage before without incident? The opening segment unfolded smoothly, with Jimmy tossing softballs about George's latest humanitarian efforts. The conversation danced around safe topics, philanthropy, the glitz of Hollywood, and George's knack for balancing stardom with activism. But the air grew heavier as Jimmy pivoted to a more pointed question, one that seemed innocent but carried a barb. He asked about George's vocal stance on a recent wave of labor strikes sweeping through the entertainment industry, a topic dominating headlines and dividing opinions. Why was George, a man of wealth and privilege, so outspoken about workers' rights? Wasn't it a bit performative? Jimmy prodded, his tone teasing but edged with skepticism. The audience chuckled, but George's smile faltered, his jaw tightening. The question wasn't just a jab, it was a challenge, one that questioned his authenticity in a way that felt personal. George responded with measured grace, explaining how his own rise in the industry had shown him the disparities faced by crew members, the unsung backbone of every film. He spoke of long hours, stagnant wages, and the growing chasm between executives and those who made their visions reality. His words were earnest, but Jimmy wasn't satisfied. He leaned forward, his grin now more predatory than playful, and pressed harder, suggesting that George's advocacy was less about principle and more about staying relevant in a changing cultural landscape. The accusation hung in the air, and the audience's laughter dwindled into uneasy murmurs. Was Jimmy trying to expose a hypocrisy, or was he baiting George for the sake of ratings? The shift in mood was palpable, a spark threatening to ignite. As the segment neared its end, George's composure began to fray. His responses grew shorter, his tone clipped, and his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. Jimmy, sensing the tension, doubled down, recounting an anecdote about a studio executive who claimed George's involvement in the strikes was stirring unrest among workers. The story was vague, possibly fabricated, but it landed like a grenade. George's hand clenched the armrest, his knuckles whitening. He didn't interrupt, but his silence was louder than any retort. The audience, now fully aware of the rift, leaned forward, caught between discomfort and fascination. What had started as a routine interview was veering into uncharted territory, and the question lingered. Would George take the bait? Or would he rise above Jimmy's provocations? The commercial break arrived just in time, but the stage was set for a confrontation that would leave no one unscathed. The commercial break did little to cool the simmering tension on the set. As the cameras flickered back to life, the audience's nervous energy filled the studio, their whispers a low hum beneath the bright stage lights. George Clooney sat rigid, his earlier warmth replaced by a steely resolve that seemed to radiate from him. Jimmy, undeterred, leaned back in his chair with a practiced ease, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, as if he sensed he had pushed too far yet couldn't resist the lure of the moment. The segment opened with a lighter tone, Jimmy cracking a joke about George's penchant for practical jokes on film sets, but the attempt at levity fell flat. The audience's laughter was hesitant, their attention fixed on the unspoken battle unfolding before them. Jimmy steered the conversation back to the labor strikes, doubling down on his earlier insinuations. He recounted a supposed rumor that George's involvement had pressured studios into negotiations they weren't ready for, causing delays in major productions. The claim was bold, speculative, and laced with an accusation that George was overstepping his role as an actor. George's expression darkened, but he responded with a calm that felt almost dangerous, explaining that the strikes were about fairness, not disruption, and that every worker deserved a voice. His words were measured, but there was a fire behind them, a conviction that made Jimmy's probing seem petty by comparison. The audience sensed the shift, their murmurs growing quieter as they hung on George's every word. The dynamic between the two men grew increasingly fraught. Jimmy, perhaps sensing he was losing the crowd, adopted a more confrontational stance, his questions less disguised as humor and more pointedly accusatory. He suggested that George's activism was a convenient way to deflect from his own privileged lifestyle, a barb that cut deeper than the earlier jabs. The audience gasped softly, the line crossing into territory that felt too personal, too raw. George's response was swift but controlled, his voice low as he countered that Jimmy's mockery of the strikes trivialized the struggles of thousands. The rebuke landed hard, and for a moment Jimmy faltered, his grin slipping as the weight of George's words settled over the room. As the segment progressed, the confrontation escalated, each man digging in further. Jimmy, now visibly rattled, made a critical misstep, dismissing the strikes as a Hollywood tantrum that hurt more than it helped. The comment was flippant, careless, and it ignited something in George. His eyes flashed with anger, and he leaned forward, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. He accused Jimmy of pandering to the powerful, of using his platform to belittle those who dared to demand better. The audience was stunned, their silence absolute as George's words echoed. Jimmy, caught off guard, scrambled to regain control, but the damage was done. The segment ended abruptly, the tension unresolved, leaving the audience to wonder how much further this clash could go before it shattered the facade of civility entirely. The studio lights seemed to burn hotter as the next segment began, the audience's anticipation now tinged with unease. George Clooney's last rebuke had left a mark, and Jimmy Kimmel, usually so quick to deflect with humor, appeared visibly shaken. His opening monologue was stilted, the jokes landing with a hollow thud as the crowd's attention remained fixed on the guest chair, where George sat with an unyielding intensity. The earlier exchange had stripped away the veneer of camaraderie, leaving a raw, confrontational energy that pulsed through the room. Jimmy, determined to reclaim his footing, shifted tactics, pivoting to a seemingly neutral topic, George's recent directorial project. But the detour felt forced, a flimsy attempt to sidestep the fault line that had cracked open between them. The conversation about filmmaking was short-lived. Jimmy, unable to resist, circled back to the labor strikes, framing his next question as a hypothetical. He asked what George would say to critics who argued his activism was divisive, sowing discord in an industry already battered by economic pressures. The question was a trap, designed to paint George as a reckless idealist, and the audience sensed it, their murmurs rising like a tide. George's response was deliberate, his voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. He spoke of the real human cost of inaction, of crew members struggling to afford health care while executives reaped millions. His words were not just a defense but a challenge, turning the spotlight on Jimmy's complicity and glossing over systemic inequities. Jimmy bristled, his composure fraying further. He countered with a sharp remark, accusing George of preaching from a pedestal, a man whose wealth insulated him from the consequences of his crusade. The insult was crude, a low blow that drew audible gasps from the audience. George's face tightened, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Jimmy with an intensity that silenced the room. He recounted a story of a grip he had met on a recent set, a man with 2 decades of experience who had been forced to choose between paying rent and buying medication. The story was raw, unembellished, and it hit the audience like a gut punch, their silence a testament to its impact. Jimmy's attempt to interrupt was feeble, his voice drowned out by the weight of George's narrative. The exchange marked a turning point. George's authenticity, his willingness to bear the human toll of the strikes, shifted the room's allegiance. The audience, once divided, now leaned toward him, their applause sporadic but growing. Jimmy, sensing the tide turning, grew defensive, his questions more erratic, his tone bordering on petulant. He made a fatal error, dismissing George's story as anecdotal, a single case that didn't justify upending an entire industry. The comment was callous, and it sparked a fire in George. His next words were a controlled detonation, accusing Jimmy of hiding behind cynicism to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. The audience erupted, their cheers a rebuke to Jimmy's insensitivity, as the segment closed with George holding the moral high ground, leaving Jimmy exposed and scrambling to salvage his authority. The studio hummed with a restless energy as the next segment kicked off, the audience now fully invested in the clash unfolding before them. George Clooney's last verbal salvo had left Jimmy Kimmel reeling, his usual charisma replaced by a brittle defensiveness that was impossible to ignore. The crowd's allegiance had shifted, their sporadic cheers for George a stinging rebuke to the host's faltering control. Jimmy, aware of the cameras capturing every misstep, tried to reset the tone, launching into a segment meant to showcase George's lighter side, a pre-recorded clip of him mentoring young filmmakers. But the footage felt hollow, a distraction that couldn't erase the raw intensity of their earlier exchange. The audience watched, but their focus remained on the live tension, waiting for the next spark. Jimmy, desperate to regain the upper hand, abandoned the clip early and dove back into the fray. He framed his next question as a challenge, asking George why he felt entitled to speak for workers when his own career had been built on the same system he now criticized. The question was laced with venom, a thinly veiled attempt to paint George as a hypocrite. The audience stirred, sensing the escalation, their murmurs a mix of shock and anticipation. George's response was immediate, his voice low but piercing. He acknowledged his privilege, but turned the question back on Jimmy, pointing out how the host's platform thrived on the labor of countless unseen workers, from writers to stagehands, whose struggles Jimmy had mocked moments earlier. The counterpunch landed hard, and the crowd roared, their applause a tidal wave that drowned out Jimmy's attempt to interject. The confrontation grew more personal, each man peeling back layers of pretense. Jimmy, now visibly rattled, made a reckless move, accusing George of using the strikes to boost his own image, a calculated ploy to stay relevant in an industry that valued youth over experience. The accusation was cruel, and it crossed a line that even the most jaded audience members felt. George's eyes narrowed, his silence more menacing than any outburst. When he finally spoke, his words were a scalpel, dissecting Jimmy's career with surgical precision. He reminded the audience of Jimmy's early days, scraping by as a radio host, and how his success had come on the backs of the very workers he now dismissed. The story was a masterstroke, turning Jimmy's own history against him, and the audience's reaction was electric, their cheers a chorus of validation for George's defiance. Jimmy's face flushed, his control slipping entirely. He tried to pivot, tossing out a weak joke to diffuse the tension, but it fell flat, the audience's loyalty now firmly with George. The segment ended with George sitting back, his expression one of quiet triumph, while Jimmy fumbled through a transition to the next break. The studio was a powder keg, the confrontation teetering on the edge of something explosive. The audience, gripped by the drama, knew they were witnessing a rare moment, one where the polished facade of a talk show had cracked, revealing the raw human conflict beneath. The stage was set for a reckoning, and no one could look away. The studio pulsed with a charged silence as the next segment began, the audience hanging on the edge of their seats. George Clooney's evisceration of Jimmy Kimmel's dismissive attitude had shifted the entire dynamic, leaving the host exposed and the crowd firmly in George's corner. Jimmy, his face a mask of strained composure, tried to steer the show back to safer ground, introducing a planned game segment meant to lighten the mood. But the attempt was futile, the audience's energy too raw, their focus locked on the unresolved tension between the two men. George's posture remained unyielding, his gaze fixed on Jimmy with a quiet intensity that seemed to dare the host to dig his hole deeper. Jimmy, sensing the futility of pretense, abandoned the game almost immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice tight with barely concealed frustration, and accused George of turning the interview into a soapbox, hijacking the show for his own agenda. The accusation was bold, an attempt to reclaim authority by casting George as the aggressor, but it backfired spectacularly. The audience, now attuned to Jimmy's tactics, murmured in dissent, their loyalty to George solidified by his earlier authenticity. George's response was a masterclass in restraint, his words measured but devastating. He pointed out that Jimmy had invited the confrontation by mocking a cause that affected thousands, and that his discomfort now was merely the consequence of being called out. The crowd erupted, their applause a thunderous endorsement that shook the studio. The exchange grew increasingly heated, each man abandoning the veneer of civility. Jimmy, cornered and desperate, made a critical error, lashing out with a personal jab that cut deeper than any professional critique. He suggested that George's activism was a midlife crisis, a way to distract from a career that no longer commanded the spotlight. The insult was vicious, a low blow that stunned the audience into silence. George's face hardened, his eyes blazing, with a fury that was both controlled and terrifying. He didn't shout, but his voice carried a weight that silenced the room. He recounted the sacrifices of workers he had met, people who had lost homes, families, and dignity while fighting for basic rights, and contrasted their courage with Jimmy's willingness to belittle their struggle for a cheap laugh. The story was a gut punch, and the audience's response was visceral, their cheers a tidal wave of support. Jimmy, now stripped of his usual charm, floundered. His attempts to interrupt were drowned out by the crowd's fervor, and his face betrayed a mix of anger and humiliation. George pressed his advantage, his words no longer just a defense but a reckoning. He accused Jimmy of betraying the very audience he claimed to entertain, using his platform to punch down rather than lift up. The audience was on its feet, their ovation a deafening rebuke to Jimmy's hubris. The segment ended with Jimmy visibly deflated, his authority in tatters, while George sat back, his triumph undeniable. The stage was set for a final confrontation, one that would leave no doubt about who had won this battle of wills. The studio was a cauldron of emotion as the penultimate segment began, the audience's fervor still reverberating from George Clooney's devastating takedown of Jimmy Kimmel. The host, his confidence shattered, sat hunched in his chair, his attempts at humor abandoned under the weight of the crowd's disapproval. George, by contrast, exuded a quiet strength, his earlier fury now tempered by a resolve that commanded the room. The audience, electrified by the raw authenticity of the confrontation, waited with bated breath, sensing that the clash was building toward an inevitable climax. Jimmy, aware that his reputation hung in the balance, made a final desperate bid to salvage the show, but the air was thick with the certainty that he was outmatched. Jimmy opened the segment with a shaky apology, acknowledging that his comments about the labor strikes may have come across as insensitive. The gesture was meant to diffuse the tension, but it rang hollow, a calculated move that failed to mask his earlier callousness. The audience's response was tepid, their trust in the host eroded by his repeated missteps. George, unswayed by the olive branch, leaned forward, his expression one of unrelenting clarity. He didn't attack, but instead posed a question that cut to the heart of the matter, asking Jimmy why he felt compelled to undermine a movement that sought only to level the playing field. The question was simple, but its weight was crushing, exposing the chasm between Jimmy's privilege and the struggles he had mocked. Jimmy faltered, his response a rambling defense that only deepened his isolation. He claimed he was playing devil's advocate, trying to spark debate, but the excuse fell flat, the audience's murmurs turning to outright jeers. George's next move was surgical, his voice steady as he recounted a moment from his own career when he had witnessed a studio executive berate a crew member for daring to ask for overtime pay. The story was vivid, human, and it resonated deeply, reminding the audience of the stakes behind the strikes. Jimmy's attempt to interject was feeble, his words drowned out by the crowd's swelling applause for George, who had transformed the interview into a platform for truth. The segment became a referendum on Jimmy's conduct, each of George's words a nail in the coffin of the host's credibility. He spoke not just of the strikes, but of the broader betrayal of those who toiled behind the scenes, their contributions erased by the glitz of the industry. The audience was rapt, their cheers a chorus of solidarity that left Jimmy visibly diminished. In a final act of defiance, Jimmy snapped, ordering George to leave the set, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and humiliation. The outburst was shocking, but it only cemented George's victory, the audience erupting in a standing ovation as he rose, his dignity intact. The segment closed with Jimmy alone at his desk, the weight of his defeat palpable, while George's exit was a moment of unassailable triumph, the crowd's roar following him off the stage. The final segment opened to a studio transformed by the weight of what had just transpired. Jimmy Kimmel sat alone at his desk, the absence of George Clooney a glaring void that amplified the host's isolation. The audience, still buzzing from their standing ovation for George, remained on edge, their loyalty now wholly with the guest who had turned the show into a battleground for truth. Jimmy's face was a study in defeat, his usual swagger replaced by a hollow attempt to regain control. He tried to pivot to the night's closing monologue, but the words felt rote, his delivery stripped of its usual spark. The crowd's attention lingered on the empty guest chair, a silent testament to George's triumph and the seismic shift that had unfolded. Jimmy, aware of the cameras and the audience's judgment, made a last-ditch effort to address the confrontation. He acknowledged the intensity of the exchange, framing it as a passionate difference of opinion. But the attempt at reconciliation was met with scattered boos. The audience had seen through his earlier cynicism, and no amount of backpedaling could erase the memory of George's raw, unyielding defense of the marginalized. Jimmy's voice wavered as he spoke, his attempt to wrap the show on a light note falling flat against the crowd's palpable disdain. The studio, once a space of laughter and levity, now felt like a courtroom where Jimmy had been found wanting. Off-stage, George's departure had left an indelible mark. Whispers among the crew suggested he had paused to shake hands with stagehands, thanking them for their work in a gesture that contrasted sharply with Jimmy's detachment. The story spread like wildfire, fueling the audience's admiration and cementing George's victory as not just a moment of televised drama, but a stand for something larger. The crowd, still seated, began to chant George's name, a spontaneous act of defiance that drowned out Jimmy's closing remarks. The host's smile was strained, his eyes betraying a flicker of resentment as he realized the show had slipped from his grasp entirely. As the credits rolled, the audience rose once more, their applause not for the show, but for the man who had walked away unbroken. Jimmy remained at his desk, the spotlight harsh against his slumped posture, a man diminished by his own hubris. The episode had become a cultural flashpoint, a moment where one man's courage had exposed the fragility of another's facade. For the viewers at home, the story was complete, a journey from tension to confrontation to triumph, with George emerging not just as a victor, but as a symbol of conviction. The show faded to black, leaving no loose ends, only the resounding echo of a battle won through authenticity and heart.